Potatoes, watermelon, corn. These are three foods that we commonly eat in California. Potatoes come from Idaho. The flight distance from Idaho to California is 622 miles. The carbon footprint of the flight is 0.09 metric tons of CO2 emissions. The carbon footprint if the food is trucked in is 1.018 metric tons of CO2 emissions. Watermelon comes from Texas. The flight distance from Texas to California is 1,318 miles. The carbon footprint of a flight is 0.43 metric tons of CO2 emissions. The carbon footprint if the food is trucked in is 2.158 metric tons of CO2 emissions. Corn. Corn comes from Iowa. The flight distance from Iowa to California is 1,475 miles. The carbon footprint of the flight is 0.18 tons of CO2 emissions. The carbon footprint if the food is trucked in is 2.415 metric tons of CO2 emissions. Why should we care about CO2 emissions? Carbon footprint is a greenhouse gas emitted into the air. We should care because greenhouse gases emitted into the air are responsible for the greenhouse effect, which ultimately lead to global warming. Therefore, the amount of greenhouse gas emissions put into the air is based on our daily decisions. If we decide to buy locally instead of buying food that comes from out of state, we're supporting local vendors that drove less miles, which means less CO2 in the air. Issues such as these allow room for concerned individuals to begin the food justice movement.
The food justice movement is a movement that strives for justice for not only food, but for social and environmental justice. As authors of Racial Ethnicity, Multidisciplinary Global Context, Holt Jimenez and Wang said that food justice is attempting to address racism and classism on one hand while trying to fix a broken food system on the other. Food justice ties the other movements together and exploring the intersections of food and justice. The food justice movement first emerged during the 1930s during the Great Depression. In the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, food justice became essential during this time period. All of what makes up food justice is recognizing that all of the movements are intertwined within the food justice movement. An uprising of minorities came together to aid the people in their nation. Groups like the Black Panthers, who established a food program for children across the nation. It was a free breakfast for children program. The Mexican and Filipinos, either American or not, came together and went on the Delano grape strike for the poor working conditions which were ignored by their bosses. Native Americans still fighting for their rights to present day. In an article by Alkan and Agaiman named Introduction to Food Justice says, the appropriation of Native American lands by white settlers and past and present day forced assimilation are examples of racial projects that have deprived some Native American tribes of both material wealth and cultural sovereignty. While these communities' circumstances are widely divergent, various chapters in this volume demonstrate the ways that racial projects have led to widespread hunger, exploitation, and environmental degradation. In response, communities of color are beginning to engage in food justice activism in order to provide food for themselves while imagining new ecological and social relationships. Food justice other main goals is for communities to be able to grow their own food and food that is nutritious and affordable. It also implies that the workers and environment are to be taken care of as well. These goals are important because in order to help people who are being affected for lack of healthy food access, we must understand that there are other underlying issues for environmental and racial that affect the food systems. Alcon and Agaiman state, studies of food justice offers excellent opportunity to bring environmental justice, and just sustainability literatures together with contemporary social sciences approaches to race because food is deeply intertwined with both personal and cultural identities. Neoliberalism is a philosophy that defined the rules of capitalism. The impact of neoliberalism on social and economic life is tremendous. This political philosophy promotes market based and state based solutions to social problems. The issue with neoliberalism is that food justice rejects its aspects, yet it needs it to operate within it. Neoliberalism isn't the only solution of increasing food access. The USDA came up with a program called FARA, or the Food Desert Concept, which has helped contribute to the discussion of areas of low food access. The program itself is faulty, and Alcon and Gaiman said this in their article. In the case of FARA, adequate food access can be achieved through improved big retail food accessibilities, proximity to supermarkets. Food retail in the USA and Western Europe is increasingly dominated by the small number of oligarchic transnational corporations that are continually emerging, consolidating, and absorbing independent retailers. Thus, we see how the USDA FARA tactically promotes private market solutions to inadequate food access, legitimizing the market as a remedy to social ills associated with inadequate food access. FARA indicates that food justice movement has been folded into the broader neoliberal political economy that is backed up by the USDA. The supermarkets are supposed to be the neoliberal solution to food access problems. However, we see that this puts the responsibility from the state to the market. Food justice is the movement that will have all of the elements into finding the solution for classism, racism, and environmental issues.
The local food movement began as a reaction to a change in the federal farm policy in the 1970s. Through this change, President Nixon had promised to cut food prices, but by doing this, he shifted federal dollars from supporting the farmers to only supporting a few commodity crops, for example, corn, soybeans, and wheat. Although food prices did drop, the farmers suffered considerably. Many downfalls included what people describe as the end of farming. This was because many farmers left their fields. Small farmers were then bought out by big companies, which had the ability to provide higher amounts of commodity crops. Through this came the beginning of the local food movement. Local food, by definition, is food that is grown locally. Others define local food by food that is grown by local independent farmers, opposed to food produced by large agribusiness, such as Foster Farms or Tyson. The local food movement is aimed to link together local farmers that produce food and then come together to sell it at farmers market. The food quality of local food is usually eaten right after harvest. Therefore, the need for chemical preservatives to help make the food last longer does not exist in these foods. Local food also supports local families who are selling the food by cutting out the middleman, which overall helps them sustain their farms. Some even say that local food builds communities because of the interaction between one another. There is much support behind the local food movement. However, there is also much critique. One being, eating locally tends to be more expensive to the consumer, as well as consumers not being able to have much of a variety due to only producing in-season produce. Another major critique is that by advertising local food, it damages the economy of third world countries, which heavily depends on the success their food brings them. CO2 emission is also another well-known drawback. In 2007, the New York Times released an article that gave examples of how eating locally grown food sometimes causes an increase instead of a decrease in the carbon footprint. According to their study, of all the greenhouse gases emitted by the food industry, only 4% comes from transporting the food from producers to retailers.
As more consumers become well aware of the effects of factory farm foods, they are turning to food movements for advice on how to eat better. One of the most prominent and most recognized movement is the slow food movement. Formed in Italy in 1989, slow food was created as a protest against fast food and to encourage people to eat locally grown, sustainable produce. Slow food was started by Carlo Petrini and a group of activists in the 1980s with the initial aim to defend regional traditions, good food, gastronomic pleasure, and a slow pace of life. The main focus of the slow food movement is to use food that is produced in accordance with local culinary traditions, typically using high quality, locally sourced ingredients. As a grassroots movement, they try to inspire the community to change the world through food that is good, clean, and fair for all. As the slow food movement grows, it tries to keep and stay true to the core values of good, clean, and fair food. Good refers to the belief that delicious and nutritious is a right for everyday life. It cultivates joyful connections to community and place, advocates for diversity in ecosystems and societies. Clean refers to the way it protects natural resources for future generations. It also seeks to help people and the environment as they depend on each other, and also promotes food that is local, seasonal, and sustainably grown. FAIR stands for building local cooperations and global collaborations while respecting all laws. It also requires no prerequisites or credentials for participation, and it fights for dignity of labor from field to work. Like every activist movement has its critics, critics call the slow food movement elitist, pointing out that not everyone can afford to buy organic, locally grown food. They say that slow food cannot economically feed our global population. Industrialized farming yields much more per acre than organic farming, meaning that slow food could potentially lead to deforestation, as we would need more farmland to produce more food.